The moon hung like a broken promise over the dusty plains of Colorado Territory, casting long shadows across the endless prairie. Sarah's bare feet pounded against the hard-packed earth, each step sending jolts of pain through her legs. But she didn't dare stop. Behind her, the fading lights of Redemption Creek grew smaller, swallowed by the darkness that had become her only ally. Her wedding dress, what was left of it, caught on a sagebrush, tearing another strip from the once white fabric. The sound of ripping cloth mixed with her ragged breathing as she stumbled forward, driven by a terror that had been building for weeks. The bruises on her arms had barely begun to heal from the last time Ezra had corrected her behavior. And tonight, when she'd seen the rope in his hands and that look in his eyes, she knew she had to run. "Sarah!" His voice echoed across the plains, distant but still too close. "You come back here, girl, you hear me?" She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob and kept running. The September air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying grass and the promise of an early winter. Her breath came in white puffs as she navigated by starlight, following the old cattle trail that led away from town, away from the man who called himself her husband but had never shown her anything but cruelty. The silence of the prairie was deafening after the chaos of her escape. No more shouting, no more heavy footsteps on wooden floors, no more doors slamming, just the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant howl of a coyote. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the night had become. That's when she saw it, a warm orange glow flickering in the distance. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It could be Ezra, it could be his men. But as she drew closer, staying low and moving carefully, she realized it was just a small campfire beside a covered wagon, the kind used by drifters and traveling folk. A single horse stood tethered nearby, its head lowered as it grazed. And there, silhouetted against the firelight, sat a man. He was tall, she could tell, even with him sitting. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the gentle way he tended the fire, the careful movements of someone who understood solitude. He wore a worn leather jacket and dark trousers, nothing fancy, nothing threatening, just a traveler making camp for the night. Sarah crouched behind a large boulder, torn between fear and desperation. The cold was seeping into her bones, and she could feel exhaustion weighing down her limbs. She couldn't go back to town, she couldn't keep running forever. And this stranger, there was something about the way he sat, so still and peaceful, that made her think he might not be like the other men she'd known. A twig snapped under her foot. The man's head turned toward the sound, and for a moment their eyes met across the firelight. Sarah held her breath, every muscle tense to run again. But the stranger didn't move. He didn't shout or reach for a weapon. He simply looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness, and then, slowly, he reached for something beside him. His coat. Without a word, he stood up and held it out toward her, the gesture so gentle it made her chest ache. When she didn't move, he set the coat on a rock between them and stepped back, giving her space. "Fire's warm," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the crackling flames. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Sarah stared at him, this stranger who asked no questions and made no demands. In the firelight, she could see his face more clearly, weathered by sun and time, with kind eyes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He was perhaps 30, maybe older, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that spoke of honest work. I don't have any money," she whispered, her voice hoarse from running. "Didn't ask for any," he replied, settling back down by the fire. He poured coffee from a dented pot into a tin cup and set it next to the coat. "Name's Thomas Riley." Sarah took a tentative step forward, then another. The coat looked so warm, and the coffee smelled like heaven. When she finally reached the fire, she picked up the coat with trembling hands and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled like tobacco and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safer than she had in months. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded as if her name was a gift worth receiving. Pleased to meet you, Sarah." She sat down on the opposite side of the fire, clutching the coat around her like armor. The warmth from the flames began to chase away the chill, and for the first time since she'd started running, she allowed herself to breathe. "You running from something?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle but not prying. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her throat, where finger-shaped bruises were hidden beneath the torn collar of her dress. "Someone," she corrected quietly. Thomas studied her face in the firelight, taking in the fear that still lingered in her eyes, the defensive way she held herself. "Well," he said finally, "reckon you're safe here for the night." As if to prove his point, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a blanket, which he handed to her without ceremony. Then he moved to the other side of the fire, giving her the warmth while positioning himself between her and the darkness beyond. "Sleep if you can," he said, settling down against his saddle. "I'll keep watch." Sarah clutched the blanket, overwhelmed by this stranger's kindness. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Everyone deserves a chance to feel safe," he said finally, "even if it's just for one night." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across the endless prairie. Sarah sat wrapped in Thomas's coat and blanket, the tin cup of coffee warming her hands as she stole glances at the man who had taken her in without question. The night stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities and unspoken truths. "You don't have to talk about it," Thomas said softly, his eyes fixed on the flames. "But if you want to, I'm listening." Sarah sipped the coffee, savoring its bitter warmth. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such gentleness. "I married him 6 months ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ezra Blackwood. He owned the general store in Redemption Creek, and everyone said I was lucky to catch his eye." Thomas remained silent, but she could see his jaw tighten slightly. "At first he was different, charming even. But after the wedding," she trailed off, unable to find the words for what her marriage had become. "He hurt you," Thomas said quietly. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill. "Tonight, he had this look in his eyes, like he wanted to do more than just hurt me, like he wanted to—" She shuddered and pulled the coat tighter around herself. Thomas stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of the firelight, his hands clenched into fists. When he returned, his voice was carefully controlled. "You did the right thing running. A man who'd hurt a woman like that, he ain't a man at all." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and the fire popped and hissed as Thomas added another log. "What about you?" Sarah asked eventually. "Where are you headed?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Nowhere in particular, just moving." "Are you running from something too?" He considered this, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Maybe, or maybe I'm running towards something. Haven't figured out which yet." Sarah studied his profile in the firelight. There was pain there. She could see it in the way his shoulders carried some invisible weight. "What happened to make you so sad?" Thomas looked at her then, surprised by her directness. "Had a family once, wife, little girl. Cholera took them both 2 years back down in Texas." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and meant it. "Maria used to say I had a gift for finding lost things," Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. "Stray cattle, missing tools, people who'd wandered off. She'd laugh and say I was like a compass, always pointing toward what needed finding." He paused, staring into the flames. "But I couldn't find a way to save them." Sarah felt her heart break for this gentle man who carried such grief. "Maybe that's why you found me tonight? Maybe you're still good at finding things that need help?" Thomas looked at her with something like wonder. "Maybe you're right." The night grew deeper, and Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in months. Thomas told her about his travels, about the places he'd seen and the people he'd met. He spoke of cattle drives and mountain towns, of sunrises over the desert and storms that could shake the earth. His voice was soothing, like a lullaby, and Sarah felt her eyelids growing heavy. "I should probably keep watch," she said, fighting against the exhaustion that was finally catching up with her. "No need," Thomas assured her. "That's what I'm here for. But what if Ezra comes looking for me?" Thomas's expression hardened. "Then he'll have to go through me first." Something in his tone made Sarah believe him completely. She curled up on her side, using Thomas's saddle as a pillow, and watched him through half-closed eyes as he tended the fire. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent years taking care of himself, but there was a gentleness in his actions that spoke of someone who understood the value of kindness. "Thomas," she whispered. "Yeah, thank you for not asking questions, for just being kind." Everyone deserves kindness, Sarah, especially someone who's been hurt. As sleep finally began to claim her, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. Here, by this stranger's fire, wrapped in his coat and protected by his presence, she was safe. For the first time since her wedding day, she wasn't afraid. Thomas watched over her through the long night, occasionally adding wood to the fire to keep her warm. When she whimpered in her sleep, he spoke softly to chase away whatever nightmares plagued her dreams. And when the wind picked up, he moved quietly to position himself as a windbreak, ensuring she stayed comfortable. He thought about Maria as he watched Sarah sleep, remembering how his wife had always been drawn to helping others. "You would have liked her," he whispered to the stars. "She's got that same strong spirit you had." The night wore on, and Thomas kept his vigil, a guardian angel in worn leather and denim, protecting a woman who had stumbled into his life like a wounded bird. And for the first time in 2 years, he felt like he might have found something worth protecting again. The first light of dawn crept across the prairie like a whispered prayer, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah stirred slowly, consciousness returning with the warmth of sunlight on her face. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the terror of the night before. Then the scent of coffee and wood smoke brought it all back, along with the comforting weight of Thomas's coat around her shoulders. She sat up carefully, her body stiff from sleeping on the ground, and looked around the camp. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, but the fire had been recently fed, and a fresh pot of coffee sat warming on the coals. His horse nickered softly from where it grazed nearby, and Sarah could hear the distant sound of water trickling over stones. "Thomas!" she called out, sudden panic rising in her chest. Had he left her? Had she dreamed his kindness? "Right here," came his voice from somewhere behind a cluster of rocks, just fetching some water. Relief flooded through her as Thomas appeared, carrying a bucket and looking refreshed despite having stayed awake all night. He'd washed his face and combed his hair, and in the morning light, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a rugged way, with laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who had once known joy. "Morning," he said with a gentle smile. "How'd you sleep?" Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted, then blushed at her honesty. Thomas poured water into a basin and set it down near her with a clean cloth. "Thought you might want to wash up. There's a stream just over there if you'd prefer some privacy." The simple consideration brought tears to Sarah's eyes. When was the last time someone had thought of her comfort without expecting something in return? "Thank you," she whispered. While Sarah freshened up by the stream, Thomas prepared a simple breakfast of bacon and biscuits. She returned to find him setting out 2 plates, the morning sun catching the silver in his dark hair. He looked up as she approached, and she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of loss, as if he was seeing someone else in her place. "You remind me of her," he said quietly. "Maria." She had that same way of looking at the world, like she was seeing it fresh every morning. Sarah sat down across from him, touched by his trust in sharing such a personal memory. She must have been very special. She was. Thomas handed her a plate and settled back against his saddle. "We met in San Antonio. She was a school teacher, came out from back east to bring education to the frontier. I was working a ranch nearby, and I'd ride into town just to catch a glimpse of her walking to the schoolhouse." Sarah smiled. picturing a younger Thomas, tongue-tied and smitten. "How long were you married?" 3 years. Best 3 years of my life." His voice grew soft with memory. "She was pregnant when the cholera hit. We'd been so excited about the baby, had names picked out and everything. Emma was only 2, just learning to talk proper. She'd follow Maria around, chattering away like a little magpie." "Emma was your daughter?" Thomas nodded, his eyes distant. "Sweetest little thing you ever saw. Had Maria's dark hair and my stubborn streak. She'd climb anything she could reach, always getting into mischief." He paused, swallowing hard. They died within a day of each other. Maria first, then Emma. I couldn't save either of them." Sarah reached across the small space between them and touched his hand. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. That must have been unbearable." It was. He looked down at her hand on his, surprised by the contact. "I blame myself for a long time. Still do some days. If I'd gotten the doctor sooner, if I'd taken them to a different town." "It wasn't your fault," Sarah said firmly. "Disease doesn't choose its victims based on how much they're loved." Thomas met her eyes, and she saw something there, gratitude maybe, or recognition. Maria used to say something similar, that some things are beyond our control, that all we can do is love the best we can while we have the chance. They ate in comfortable silence, the morning sun warming their faces. Sarah found herself studying Thomas's hands as he ate. Strong, calloused from years of hard work, but gentle when he handed her more coffee or reached for the salt. These were hands that had worked to provide for a family, that had held a sick child and comforted a dying wife. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked eventually. Sarah had been dreading this question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back to Redemption Creek. Ezra will be looking for me, and even if he wasn't, I could never live with him again." "Do you have family somewhere? People who might take you in?" Sarah shook her head. "My parents died when I was 16. That's why I married Ezra in the first place. I thought I needed a husband to take care of me." She laughed bitterly. "Turns out I was better off taking care of myself." Thomas studied her face, seeing the strength beneath the vulnerability. "You know, there's a town about 50 miles north of here, Cedar Falls. It's growing fast. Lots of opportunities for someone willing to work hard. They've got a school that needs a teacher, and I heard tell the doctor's wife is looking for someone to help with her nursing. You think I could do something like that?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," Thomas said with conviction. "You've got more courage than most men I know. Takes real strength to leave everything behind and start over." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Would you take me there? I could pay you something once I find work." Thomas shook his head. "I wouldn't take your money, but I'd be honored to see you safely to Cedar Falls." As they prepared to break camp, Sarah found herself watching Thomas with new eyes. He moved with quiet efficiency, packing his belongings and saddling his horse with the practiced ease of someone who had done this countless times. But there was something different about him this morning, a lightness that hadn't been there the night before. "Thomas?" she said, as he helped her up onto his horse. "Yeah? I think Maria was right about you having a gift for finding lost things. You found me when I needed finding most." Thomas smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it reached his eyes. "Maybe we found each other." Barefoot. As they rode away from the camp, Sarah looked back once at the place where she'd found sanctuary. The fire was out, the rocks scattered, but the memory of that night, of Thomas's kindness and the safety she'd felt, would stay with her forever. She was still running, still heading toward an uncertain future, but now she wasn't running alone. The town of Cedar Falls spread before them like a promise, its main street bustling with activity even in the early afternoon. Sarah had never seen so many people in one place. Cowboys fresh from cattle drives, families in their Sunday best, merchants hawking their wares from colorful storefronts. The air hummed with possibility and the kind of energy that came from a place where people were building something new. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, taking in the neat rows of houses, the white steepled church, and the school that sat proudly on a small hill overlooking the town. Thomas reined in his horse at the edge of the main street, and Sarah felt a sudden pang of sadness. Their journey together was ending, and she realized she wasn't ready to say goodbye to this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "There's the hotel." Thomas pointed to a 2-story building with a painted sign that read Cedar Falls Inn. "Mrs. Henderson runs it, and she's got a good reputation. She'll help you get settled." Sarah nodded but made no move to dismount. "What about you? Where will you go?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "I've been thinking about that. There's a ranch outside of town, the Double K. I heard they're looking for a foreman. Maybe it's time I stopped drifting and put down roots somewhere." "You mean you might stay?" Sarah tried to keep the hope out of her voice. "Maybe, if the job works out." He looked at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Depends on whether I can find a reason to stay." Their eyes met, and Sarah felt her heart skip. In the space of a night and a day, this stranger had become someone she couldn't imagine living without. "Thomas, Sarah Mitchell?" A woman's voice interrupted them. They turned to see a plump, middle-aged woman in a neat blue dress approaching them with a warm smile. "I'm Eleanor Henderson. I run the inn. Thomas Riley sent word you'd be coming." Sarah looked at Thomas in surprise. "You sent word?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Stopped by the telegraph office in the last town. Thought it might help to have someone expecting you." Mrs. Henderson beamed at them both. "Well, aren't you just the sweetest thing, child? And Thomas, you're exactly as described. Come on down from there, both of you. I've got a room ready and a hot meal waiting." As Thomas helped Sarah down from the horse, their hands lingered together longer than necessary. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "You don't need to thank me," he replied quietly. "You gave me something too." "What?" "A reason to stop running." Mrs. Henderson bustled them into the inn, chattering about the town and the opportunities available for a young woman of good character. Sarah learned that the previous schoolteacher had gotten married and moved away, leaving the position open. The doctor's wife, Mrs. Patterson, was indeed looking for help with her nursing duties. There was even talk of starting a women's auxiliary to help new families settling in the area. "You'll fit right in, dear," Mrs. Henderson assured her as she showed Sarah to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "This is a good place for fresh starts." Later that evening, Sarah sat in the inn's parlor with Mrs. Henderson and several other women from the town. They were kind and welcoming, eager to help her settle in, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching for Thomas. "He's a good man, that Thomas Riley," Mrs. Henderson said, following her gaze. "Heard he lost his family down in Texas. Terrible thing." "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "He told me. Jim Patterson, that's the doctor. He met with Thomas this afternoon about the foreman position. Said he's impressed with his experience and his character. Might just work out for both of them." Sarah's heart leaped. "He's really going to stay." "Seems likely, though I suspect his decision might have more to do with you than with cattle ranching." Sarah blushed, but before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Henderson opened it to reveal Thomas, cleaned up and wearing a fresh shirt, his hat in his hands. "Evening, ladies," he said politely. "I was wondering if I might have a word with Miss Sarah." The other women exchanged knowing glances and quickly excused themselves, leaving Sarah and Thomas alone in the parlor. He sat down across from her, his expression serious. "I spoke with Dr. Patterson about the foreman job," he began. "He's offered me the position." "That's wonderful," Sarah exclaimed. "Are you going to take it?" Thomas studied her face. "That depends. On you." "On me?" "Sarah, I know we've only known each other for a day, but..." He ran his hand through his hair, struggling with the words. "I haven't felt this way since Maria died. You've brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever." Sarah's heart raced. "Thomas, I'm not asking you to make any promises," he continued quickly. "I know you need time to heal, to figure out who you are when you're not afraid. But I'd like to be here while you do, if you'll have me." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'd like that very much." Thomas smiled, that real smile that transformed his whole face. "Then I guess Cedar Falls has gained 2 new residents." As they sat together in the warm lamplight, Sarah thought about the night before, how she'd run into the darkness with nothing but fear and desperation, and how she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Thomas had been right about having a gift for finding lost things. He'd found her when she needed finding most, and in doing so had found himself again. "Thomas," she said softly. "Yeah? I still don't know your middle name." He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "It's James. Thomas James Riley." "Thomas James Riley," she repeated, tasting the name. "I like it." Outside, the sounds of Cedar Falls settling in for the night drifted through the window, horses nickering, doors closing, the distant sound of someone playing a guitar. It was the sound of home, of belonging, of second chances. Sarah looked at Thomas, this man who had appeared in her darkest hour like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. Tomorrow, she would start her new life in earnest. She would apply for the teaching position, meet with Mrs. Patterson about the nursing work, and begin the process of becoming the woman she was meant to be. But tonight, she was content to sit in the lamplight with Thomas James Riley, the stranger who had protected her through the darkness and helped her find her way to the dawn. "I think I'm going to like it here," she said. Thomas reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I think I am too." Outside, the stars began to appear one by one, the same stars that had watched over them the night before. But now, instead of marking their flight from the past, they seemed to be lighting the way toward a future neither of them had dared to imagine. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, and Sarah smiled. She had escaped in the night, and a stranger had protected her until morning came. But more than that, she had found hope in the darkness and love in the most unexpected place. The night had ended, but their story was just beginning. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the small house on Maple Street, casting gentle patterns across the wooden floor. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas work with the young horses in the paddock behind their home. His movements were confident and sure, the same quiet strength that had drawn her to him that night on the prairie 2 years ago. "Mrs. Riley," a small voice piped up from the kitchen table, "are you going to finish the story?" Sarah turned to find 8-year-old Mary Patterson, the doctor's daughter, looking at her expectantly. Around the table sat 5 other children, all waiting for the conclusion of the tale Sarah had been telling them during their weekly reading lesson. "Where were we?" Sarah asked, settling back into her chair with a smile. "The princess had just escaped from the tower," said young Billy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's grandson. "And she met the kind woodsman in the forest." Sarah's eyes drifted back to the window, where Thomas was gently stroking a mare's neck, his voice too low to hear, but his gestures speaking of infinite patience. "Ah, yes," she said softly. "Well, the princess discovered that sometimes the most unlikely people can become the most important ones in our lives." It had been 18 months since Sarah had become Mrs. Thomas Riley in a simple ceremony at the Cedar Falls Church. The whole town had celebrated, and even now, Sarah could hardly believe how completely her life had changed. The frightened woman who had run barefoot through the prairie seemed like someone from another lifetime. "Did they live happily ever after?" asked little Emma Foster, her eyes wide with hope. "They lived," Sarah said carefully, "with purpose and love, which is sometimes better than happily ever after." The children seemed satisfied with this answer, and Sarah dismissed them with assignments to practice their letters. As they filed out, chattering about the story, Sarah began cleaning up the makeshift classroom that had once been their parlor. The teaching position at the school had led to private tutoring sessions, which had grown into a small academy for the younger children of Cedar Falls. Sarah had discovered a gift for nurturing young minds, and the work filled her with a satisfaction she'd never known was possible. "Sarah," Thomas's voice called from the back door. "Could you come out here for a minute?" She found him standing beside the paddock, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back on his head. The mare he'd been working with stood calmly beside him, no longer the skittish creature she'd been when Thomas first brought her home. "Look at this," he said, running his hand along the horse's neck. "She's finally letting me touch her without flinching." Sarah understood. The mare had been abused by her previous owner, beaten and mistreated until she feared all human contact. Thomas had spent months earning her trust, never rushing, never forcing, always patient. "She's beautiful," Sarah said, approaching slowly. The mare's ears flicked toward her but didn't flatten in fear. "Took her a while to believe that not all people would hurt her," Thomas said quietly, and Sarah knew he wasn't just talking about the horse. Sarah reached out tentatively, and the mare allowed her to stroke her nose. "Some wounds take time to heal," she said, "but with patience and love, they can learn to trust again," Thomas finished. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the other horses graze in the paddock. The Double K Ranch had prospered under Thomas's management, and Dr. Patterson had made him a partner in the operation. More importantly, Thomas had found his place in the community, becoming the kind of man people turned to for advice and help. "Thomas," Sarah said suddenly, "do you ever think about that night, when you found me?" He turned to study her face. "Every day. Why?" "I was just thinking about how lost I was, how certain I was that my life was over." She leaned against the fence rail, her eyes distant. "I thought I was running away from something. I didn't realize I was running towards something better." Thomas moved closer, his hand covering hers on the fence. "Maria used to say that sometimes God puts people in our path exactly when we need them most. Do you think she would have approved of us, I mean?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I think she would have loved you," he said finally. "She always said I needed someone who could match my stubborn streak and call me out when I was being foolish." Sarah laughed. "Well, I certainly do that." "That you do." Thomas squeezed her hand. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." A rider approached from the direction of town, and they recognized Sheriff Morrison's distinctive bay gelding. The sheriff was a friend now, but Sarah still felt a flutter of old anxiety whenever she saw him coming. "Afternoon, Tom, Sarah," Morrison called as he dismounted. "Got some news that might interest you." Sarah's heart quickened. "What kind of news?" "Just got word from down south. Ezra Blackwood's been arrested. Turns out he's been involved in some shady business dealings, cheating folks out of their land. He's looking at serious jail time." Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her, ready to protect her from whatever emotions this news might bring. But to her surprise, all she felt was a distant sense of closure. "Thank you for telling us," she said calmly. Morrison tipped his hat. "Thought you'd want to know. That chapter of your life is well and truly closed now." After the sheriff left, Thomas turned to Sarah with concern. "Are you all right?" Sarah considered the question. Was she all right? The woman who had fled into the night 2 years ago would have collapsed with relief at this news. But now, standing in the sunshine beside her husband, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Ezra Blackwood seemed like a shadow from someone else's past. "I'm fine," she said, and meant it. "He can't hurt me anymore. He never really could after that night you found me." Thomas smiled and pulled her into his arms. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you were never really lost that night. You were just finding your way to where you belonged." Sarah thought about this as she looked around at their small piece of paradise. The house they'd built with their own hands, the horses they'd gentled with patience and love, the children who looked up to her with trust and affection, the community that had welcomed them both with open arms. "Thomas," she said softly. "Yeah? I love you." He kissed her forehead, the gesture as tender as it had been on their wedding day. "I love you too, Sarah Riley." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had run into the darkness with nothing but fear and desperation, and she had found everything she'd never dared to hope for. The night had ended long ago, but its gift, the love and protection of a good man, the strength to rebuild her life, the courage to trust again, would last forever. In the distance, the church bells rang out over the town, calling people home for supper. Sarah took Thomas's hand, and together they walked toward their house, toward the life they'd chosen, toward a future bright with possibility. She had escaped in the night, and a stranger had protected her until morning came. But more than that, she had found her way home.